what I'd like to do is to try and ask and tentatively answer 5 questions. And those questions are: what is the current situation with the pandemic? And I'll focus on the United Kingdom. Secondly, what lessons might we learn from the past 8 months? Third, what could we have done better? Now, there's a long list of things there, so I'll try and be as abbreviated as possible. Fourth, will we have a vaccine? Not when will we have a vaccine, but will we have a vaccine? And then lastly, what should the government do now? This government. Now, if I leapt into trying to answer those 5 questions straight away, I think you would feel that I was extremely negative and pessimistic in all of the answers to those 5 questions. So I want to start off by striking a note of optimism, because I do in the long term, I am optimistic in the longer term. And the reason why I'm optimistic in the longer term is because of history. There have been several really excellent books written in recent years, Mark Honigsbaum, Laura Spinney, looking at the history of pandemics and epidemics. And when one looks back over the centuries of those pandemics, there are several interesting features that one notices in the aftermath, because they change, societies change. And although they initially change for the worse, the immediate impacts of the pandemic, in the longer term, they often change for the better. A pandemic will erase one society and create a brand new society in that aftermath. And often that new society that's been created out of the tragedy of the plague, new societal beginnings will often germinate. And there's frequently a sense of regeneration of society according to a recalibrated set of values. So that's an optimistic reflection on how society might change in the medium to long term. Governments also change. Lessons, although it might not feel now that lessons are being learned, in the longer term, lessons are often learned. Maybe they're not sustained, but they are learned in the aftermath of a pandemic. And publics also change. People change in society. People value different qualities in their society more after an epidemic or pandemic than they did before. We will value the resilience of the National Health Service more. We will value the education of our children more. We will place more emphasis on the importance of social care in the future. People who live at the margins of society, people who are usually never seen and certainly never heard, will move much more to the center stage of our politics. So I want to frame the discussion with that note of optimism, that we are actually on the brink, and of course it's our choice if we choose this opportunity, we are potentially on the brink of what could be, and I use this word modestly, but potentially revolutionary change in the way our society is put together and the values that underpin that society. Okay, let me dive into the questions. So first of all, what's the current situation? Well, it's on the news every day. On June the 1st, there were about 1,500 tests positive of coronavirus in the country. July the 1st, it had gone down to about 800. August the 1st, about 700. And then we lost control of it. It shot up to doubled to about 1,200, 1,300 new cases a day by the 1st of September. As you've seen in the past week or so, It has now unfortunately climbed to 3,500 as of yesterday. I had hoped that we were hovering in the mid-2000s for 2 or 3 days, and I did wonder whether we might be able to contain it, but it looks like we haven't. And as you saw with those, the dreaded R values, which were published yesterday, the average R value for England is about 1.2, but there's quite a considerable variation across the country, and it's important to note those local variations. Wales has the lowest R value at the moment. It's below 1 or up to 1, but the highest are in Scotland, where it might be as high as 1.5, London as high as 1.3, and the Northwest, where it could be up to 1.3. It's estimated to be 1.1 to 1.3 in the Northwest. So we think that the epidemic is doubling about every 7 to 8 days. The people who are infected, it's a slightly different demographic this time from earlier in the pandemic, particularly in the 18 to 24-year-olds. And also some signs, unfortunately, again in the Northwest, that the oldest people over the age of 85 are also unfortunately picking up infection again. The Office for National Statistics gave their latest estimates. These are from death certificates for the numbers of people who've died from or related to coronavirus, and they put the figure at 57,417, considerably higher than some of the government figures that you will see in the 40,000s. So 57,417 at the moment, I think, is the most reliable estimate that we have from death certificates. And as you also saw Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, say last week, he expects this particular period that we're now going through, which is effectively a partial lockdown. We have something like 10 or 11% of the population in lockdown now across the country, to last through to spring. So if I had to try and put where we are in one sentence, I would say that right now we are on the edge of a precipice. Schools going back. My daughter's just gone off back to university, along with all of her university friends. We're being encouraged to go back to work, which is at least utter madness in my eyes, and winter is approaching. We have a test, trace, and isolate system, which is simply, despite the implorings of Matt Hancock, is simply dysfunctional and is not working. Not least before, and I'm surprised this isn't discussed more, not least because the injunction to only test people who are positive with symptoms misses out the fact that this particular virus has a very considerable, it could be as little as 30%, but as high as 70% of people are carrying the virus asymptomatically. And if you're not testing people who are asymptomatic, then you're going to be missing a lot of infection in the community. The economic crisis is going to get worse. So these figures that were released, I think, yesterday of showing economic growth, we're going to be in a much worse situation, and unemployment's going to skyrocket after the furlough ends at the end of October. I don't think that our politicians and our public, because our politicians aren't leading this at the moment, the government isn't leading this, I don't think that anybody's quite embraced the scale of the transformation that's hitting and is going to hit our society. I mean, this is the language that our politicians are using is very strange to me. Boris Johnson talks about how we have to defeat the virus. This virus isn't going to be defeated. This isn't a war, humans versus coronavirus, and we're going to win. This is a virus that is endemic now in our communities around the world. The goal is not to defeat the virus. The goal is to find a way to peacefully coexist with the virus. And that requires a very different mindset in the way we think about our response. and I hope we can have a chance to talk a little bit about that. I did wonder, looking at the pictures of Boris Johnson giving his press conference last week, I did wonder, he looked pretty sullen actually at times, and I did wonder whether it was sinking in perhaps that maybe this is a bigger transformation than he has publicly communicated and perhaps privately understood. So that's where I think we sit with the current situation. Now, what are the lessons? And these are really important lessons that, again, we are not discussing politically. And I think this is where we on this call have a role to try and promote some of these lessons. The first lesson, for me anyway, is that society is much more brittle than we once thought it was. And our vulnerable groups in society have been revealed. The way I think of it is that we've put a mirror up to society and to ourselves in society and seen what society is truly like. Now, we actually knew this before, but we've never had to face up to it. We've never had to really look ourselves in the eyes and say, my God, this is the way our society is constructed. Because we've seen that inequality kills. This virus has exploited and accentuated existing inequalities in our society. In one sense, the virus brought us together. We were all together in national lockdown, but what it's done is it's shown how we are so divided. Because while people like me have had the luxury of being able to sit at home and work from home, it's not people like me who've kept society going. The people who've kept society going are people on the front line of our services, health workers who've kept hospitals going, bus drivers and tube drivers who've kept transportation systems going, teachers who've kept our schools going, key workers across society, again, who are never seen, who are never heard. They're the ones who've kept our society alive, literally alive. Our older citizens, again, who are often shut away in care homes, often not receiving very good quality care, forgotten, ignored. Well, this pandemic has shown what an important segment of society our oldest old are. Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. Again, particularly targeted by this virus. The dimension of race and racism in our society, exposed. We knew it was there, but dramatically exposed by this pandemic. And women and children, don't forget the shadow pandemic of women and children locked at home, sometimes with violent partners. And we know that the amount of intimate partner violence has dramatically increased during the course of the lockdown. And as we go into further local lockdowns, this shadow pandemic acutely affecting women and children. So one of the lessons here is number one priority for government should be to focus on the welfare, the well-being of these vulnerable groups. And yet I haven't heard Boris Johnson talk about tackling inequality. He creates another commission to look at Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, but we've had umpteen commissions to look. We know what to do. He's just kicking that issue into the long grass. No serious discussion about what we do for our oldest old in terms of social care. No strategy for protecting women and children in our society. And yet this is surely, for me anyway, the number one lesson. The brittleness of our society and the need to protect and strengthen the protections around these vulnerable groups. A second lesson, which is a bit more to do with the pandemic, is that there are no magic bullets. No single drug, no single intervention, not even a vaccine, is going to be a solution to this pandemic. Even test, trace and isolate, valuable though a functioning test, trace and isolate system would be, is not going to be a magic bullet to just sweep away the effects of this pandemic. A third lesson is speed, and this is where this government was so appalling in the early stages. Now, people will take different views, and I understand if many of you would think that, if you've heard me talk about this before, think that I'm applying hindsight to what was a very challenging situation. I reject the hindsight argument. You hear Boris Johnson use the phrase Captain Hindsight against Keir Starmer almost every week in Prime Minister's questions. But I don't think it's hindsight. We published 5 research papers in The Lancet in the last week of January. And those 5 research papers go into extraordinary detail about the nature of the virus, the disease it causes, and the impact on the NHS and on society. The entire story of the last 8 months is summarized in those papers. A brand new virus, which is not influenza, but was a SARS virus, like the SARS outbreak in 2002-03 in China. A virus which causes a terrifying disease, doesn't just cause a pneumonia, it causes multi-organ failure. It causes failure of the kidneys, of the liver. It causes damage to the heart. So this is imagine health workers who were struggling to understand this disease in February, March, and April. They were struggling with a really, really frightening, extraordinary illness that they hadn't come across before. But it was all described in January. And in those papers, they set out the importance of scaling up personal protective equipment, getting a good testing system in place, building intensive care capacity. And because they figured out that it was this multi-organ failure disease, other intensive facilities such as dialysis, the whole dialysis system in the country almost collapsed because we were right up to the limit in terms of access to dialysis facilities for renal failure. And the government didn't pay attention to those messages at the end of January. And then when WHO, which has received so much unfair criticism, signaled a public health emergency of international concern on January the 30th, what did our government do? It's the most powerful weapon WHO has when the Director General signals a public health emergency of international concern. On January the 30th, that's what happened. What happened on January the 31st? Did Boris Johnson stand up and say he was going to pay attention to that? He actually stood up and celebrated, I'm sorry to say it, Brexit, and completely ignored the threat to his own country and the citizens who he was elected as an absolute first priority to protect. And even if you don't accept that part of my argument, that we should have known in the first week of February how severe that was, you have to accept this. On March the 5th, the committee that advises government, that you've heard so much about, SAGE, transmitted to politicians on March the 5th that what was taking place in northern Italy meant that the existing strategy that they'd followed of herd immunity was the wrong strategy, and that they had to take a dramatically different approach, and that the only approach that would save the lives of citizens and protect the NHS was lockdown. That was on March the 5th. Neil Ferguson has gone on the public record and said that in a Panorama program some weeks ago. And what happened? It took till March the 23rd until there was a national lockdown. Between March the 5th and March the 23rd, the epidemic was doubling every 2 to 3 days. So I don't want to sound too extreme about this, but the fact is that this government is responsible for the preventable deaths of tens of thousands of citizens of this country, directly responsible. Responsible because they didn't pay attention to the research that was published at the end of January. Responsible because they didn't listen to the warnings of the World Health Organization on January the 30th. And responsible because they didn't pay attention to the advice of their own scientific committee on March the 5th. Directly responsible. And when a public inquiry takes place, we have to make sure that the politicians who have been in charge of the response to this pandemic are held fully accountable, because this was the worst episode of government and ministerial misconduct since certainly within my lifetime. A fourth lesson is that science has been absolutely critical, and of course I would say this, but I've seen the contribution that science has made to describing the nature of the threat, to laying out the potential solutions to controlling the pandemic and preventing further consequences of the pandemic. And it's essential that we protect science. Now, I don't want to get into an argument about Brexit. This isn't a Brexit discussion. All I will say is that we are taking a path at the moment that is cutting off our scientific collaborations from the European Union. We are now in a situation where we are not an attractive place for European scientists to come to work. If you go into any laboratory up and down the country, you will find talented German, Italian, French, Spanish scientists who came to this country because they wanted to do great science, great work in a country that was a partner with their country. And we are taking a step now that is destroying those relationships. Science in the United Kingdom will be in a worse position as Brexit unfolds than when we were fully part of the European Union. And the final lesson is that the global crisis demands a global response. And this has been a lamentable failure. At a moment when we have a global emergency, we should have seen countries coming together, cooperating to identify a solution. And whether we talk about President Trump or Boris Johnson or almost any leader, you've seen this inward-looking nationalism that has led to a failure to have any global coordination whatsoever. It's unbelievable to me that at a moment where truly the world faced a crisis that should have brought us together, it has divided us still further. Now, what could we have done better? First thing that we could have done better is that we should have been prepared. We've all heard, I think now, of the fact that Public Health England conducted this pandemic preparedness in 2016, exercise Cygnus, which clearly laid out and concluded that we were not prepared for a pandemic of influenza. Did we take that evidence and scale up our potential protective response? No, we did not. We did actually nothing after exercise Cygnus. We didn't build up a testing system. We didn't build up stores of PPE. We didn't build resilience into our National Health Service. We didn't invest in our public health service. We didn't look at how we could protect the older members of our society. We just did nothing. We found out that we had an inadequate preparedness plan, and we just left it. Another example of government failure, and I have to say, sadly, I'm part of this, a failure of the health professions who should have been on top of responding to this. Public Health England, I don't believe Public Health England should have been abolished in the way that it was recently, but Public Health England notoriously failed to address the results of its own pandemic preparedness exercise. The second area where we could have done better is that we didn't take this evidence that came from China seriously. We've seen a lot of criticism of China over the last 6 months or so. I will be the first to stand up for the rights of those Uyghurs who are suffering such oppression, Tibetans who've had their rights of autonomy taken away from them, people living in Hong Kong who are now subject to a national security law that is an appalling attack on their democratic rights. I condemn those actions fully. But I know the Chinese doctors. I've been going to China several times a year for the past decade. I know those Chinese doctors and Chinese scientists and people in the National Health Commission, which is their Ministry of Health, very well indeed. These people did the most astonishing work under extremely difficult circumstances in December and January to try and understand what this pandemic threat was. And we actually owe them a debt of gratitude. When they found out how serious it was, these 5 papers we published, they weren't from Western scientists, they're all Chinese scientists and doctors writing in a language which isn't their own, telling the world their story about what was taking place in their country. They couldn't have done more to transmit this information as quickly as they did. And compare that response to what happened in early 2000s with SARS, where there was a deliberate attempt by the Chinese government and the Chinese medical community to suppress information and to lie to the international community. But that certainly was not the case here. So why didn't we take China seriously? Was it that somehow we didn't believe what was in these papers, that somehow we didn't trust the Chinese? Was there some covert kind of racism, xenophobia, that led us not to believe what was taking place? Or did we think that somehow they were exaggerating? I don't know, but we should have taken their warnings more seriously. And then what could we have done better? Well, we've just seen an astonishing series of political failures from the very beginning. Failures in science policy, it's not just a political failure, there was a technical failure too. My colleagues in the medical public health communities had access to the work that I'm talking about at the end of January, and they didn't pick this work up and signal the alarm bells about what it was telling us. One of the papers that we published made absolutely clear, it talked explicitly about the threat of a global pandemic. So we can't say that we should have been surprised by this. Let me turn to the question of a vaccine, and will we have a vaccine? Currently, there are 9 vaccine candidates in what we call phase 3 randomized trials. And I was delighted to see today the report that the Oxford vaccine trial is now back up and running, having been temporarily suspended because a patient very, very sadly developed what I suspect is a complication of the vaccine. But I'm very pleased that the trial is up and running. We have 9 vaccines. The 9 vaccines take slightly different approaches to developing immunity. All 9 show that they can provoke a very strong immune response in those who receive the vaccine, and that is excellent news. And we now have to hope that one of them, at least one of them, is protective of getting the disease. So we're not going to have that information, contrary to what President Trump has said, before the end of October. I mean, that was a naked political manipulation to try and say that in advance of the US election on November the 3rd. We won't have the results of these randomized trials until, if we're fortunate, before the end of the year. And even then, there will have to be a very, very careful regulatory review of the data before they can be licensed. And even then, you're going to have to go into this phase of manufacturing. And that is not a small operation. And at the same time, we're seeing another epidemic of vaccine nationalism, where countries are not working together, again, to try and make sure that those in greatest need get access to the vaccine first. At the moment, it is a struggle so that those with the most political power and the most money are trying to buy up the vaccine as quickly as they can. And that is the wrong way to go about distributing a vaccine in a global pandemic. We're also seeing, unfortunately, an anti-vaccination movement that's growing across the world, sometimes for different reasons in different countries, but it is growing. In the United States, a poll recently showed that over 50% of people would not accept a vaccine if it did come through by the end of October, as President Trump has suggested. So we're in a very difficult situation with the vaccine. And that's why I say, will we have one rather than when will we have one? Because there's still a lot of concern. And I'm concerned about the safety aspects because right now, China has produced several vaccines which are in phase 3 trials. Russia has one vaccine that's in a phase 3 trial. But those two countries, and I do believe this is a mistake, I'm afraid, and I would be critical of both of those governments, they have implemented the vaccine and are giving it to people, not widely to publics, but they're giving it to their military without having proper safety testing. And if it turned out that one of those vaccines did have an adverse effect, and that message was globalized, that would do extreme damage to public confidence if there was a safe and effective vaccine that eventually came through. So this is a source of serious anxiety. Now, finally, what should the government do now? Well, we could spend all of our time talking about this, so I'm going to try and be very, very, very brief. First of all, one lesson we've learned from any epidemic, and AIDS I'm of a certain age where I can remember the national response to the AIDS pandemic. Clear communication, clear, firm, regular communication. And if there's one area where the government has failed utterly, it has been in the area of communication. The confused, mixed, conflicting, contradictory messages that the government gives out pretty much on a daily basis, I'm sad to say, it has left the public with very little trust in this government. You may have seen the statistic that was published just yesterday, that now fewer than 20% of people self-isolate when they are found to have had a positive test for coronavirus. People just don't trust the government. It's not just Dominic Cummings going to Durham. It's across a whole range of failures of government communication. Second, the absolute priority should be to get the testing system right. I've said already, testing isn't going to be a magic bullet, but a testing system is needed. And again, I just do not understand why we have not used the greatest asset this country has in battling the pandemic, which is the National Health Service. The National Health Service, a decentralized primary care system, which could be the basis for testing. And instead, we've gone to private sector contractors, Serco and others, to build a parallel system which isn't working, which isn't integrated into our NHS, and which to me looks like a way to have a backdoor privatization of public health. And again, why are we not holding the government accountable for that? Every time I watch Prime Minister's questions at Wednesday lunchtime, I'm urging Keir Starmer to hold Boris Johnson accountable for this privatization of what should be a public service. But he hasn't done it yet, and I hope he does. And the third priority the government must have, and I return to where I started, and that is there must be a program for national regeneration, national revival, putting those at the margins at the center of a renewed political struggle for equity, for the right to health and well-being, and for social justice. And we're not seeing that from this government. And again, the government should be held accountable for that. So those answers to those 5 questions I know sound pessimistic and rather negative. So let me end by returning to this note of optimism I tried to strike at the beginning. Laura Spinney, in her wonderful book about the 1918 pandemic, it's called Pale Rider. It was published in 2017. It's in paperback now. Absolutely fantastic. I couldn't recommend it more strongly. She talks about how the pandemic in 1918 accelerated the pace of political and social change. Consciences were pricked. Political consciences and public consciences were pricked. And although it took another 30 years before we got the National Health Service officially, actually the public sensibility, the sentiment amongst the public for universal health coverage came out of the pandemic in 1918. People understood that you needed to have a way of protecting people when there was a massive shock. There was a war on poor housing after 1918, and there was even an artistic renewal. So there are opportunities to, if we grasp them, and it's up to us, if we grasp them, to see how we might have a moment of revival. So COVID-19 isn't going to be our destiny. It's up to you and it's up to me to write a different future for ourselves, for our society, for our children, for our families, for our friends. But we can do it. It's been done before after pandemics, and it's up to us to do it again. John, thank you very much.